Welcome. My name is Will Pomeranz. I'm the director of the Kennan Institute, and I thank you all for joining us today to discuss how Ukrainian artists have produced new decolonial narratives in response to Russia's ongoing invasion of the country. Before we begin, a few housekeeping details to go over. If you want to stay up to date with the latest Kennan Institute events and publications, you can visit our website or subscribe to our blogs, Focus Ukraine and the Russia File, and our Russian language blog, In Other Words. You can also subscribe to our podcast, Kennan X and the Russia File. Also visit our Hindsight Upfront Ukraine collection on the Wilson Center website for the latest news and analysis focused on Ukraine. To our virtual audience, if you have questions for our speaker, please submit them via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter @Kennan Institute, or on our Facebook page at any time. Please include your name and affiliation when sending questions. I will begin by briefly introducing our speaker and then give her an opportunity to deliver her remarks. Svitlana Biedarieva is a PhD and an art historian, curator, and artist. Her research focuses on contemporary Ukrainian art and Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine. She holds a PhD in the history of art from the Courtauld Institute of Art, and she is the editor of numerous volumes, including At the Front Line, Ukrainian Art 2013 and 2019. Her project at the Wilson Center focuses on Ukraine's decolonization and its cultural impact in a time of war. Svitlana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this wonderful introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. It's a great pleasure for me, especially in the capacity of a fellow at the Kennan Institute. And today I want to talk about my ongoing research that focuses on Ukrainian art's response to the war and how the war changed several perspectives in Ukrainian politically and socially engaged art practices. And in this talk, I will focus on the transformations that Ukrainian art has experienced since the outbreak of the war of Russia against Ukraine. I will discuss the stages of development of wartime art in Ukraine between 2014 and 2022. And explore the main topics which Ukrainian artists address as they challenge and dismantle long-standing Russian colonial narratives. I aim to examine how artists' work reinterprets and disputes Ukraine's belonging to the post-Soviet space and how it addresses the ongoing trauma of exposure to military violence and how these practices see military violence through a colonial perspective. I will also discuss the place of politically and socially engaged art practices and practices of resistance following the outbreak of the aggression brought about by the full-scale invasion in February 2022. So, to give some kind of, I would like to begin with theoretical framework. In my every talk, I remark that when I speak about the notions of postcolonial and decolonial, they are not interchangeable, particularly if we see them in the context of a relationship between Ukraine and Russia. Rather, they reflect two different stages of liberation from colonial entanglement. While the notion of postcolonial denotes the situation immediately following the colonial experience and reinterprets the implications of colonialism, the notion of decolonial speaks about the final process of dismantling the colonial narrative. A decolonial researcher, Madina Tlastanova, remarks on the chronological and logical discrepancies between the two approaches. She says, the postcolonial condition is more of an objective given, a geopolitical and geohistorical situation of many people coming from former colonies. The decolonial stance is one step further, as it involves a conscious choice of how to interpret reality and how to act upon it. The atrocities of the anachronistic Russian war of aggression have brought Ukraine to the culmination of decolonial stage, when the once dominating postcolonial narrative of Russian culture as enveloping Ukrainian culture has collapsed irreversibly. Indeed, any further aggression from the side of Russia towards Ukraine will only continue to foster what is an inevitable decolonial shift. Tolstanova, together with decolonial theorist Walter Mignolo, propose that a decolonial perspective is first of all an epistemological project, which is dedicated to the production of new and disentangled knowledge, as opposed to the postcolonial recombination of existing narratives as an inquiry into memory and history. So we have here two stages, precisely the postcolonial as a recombination of existing narratives related to history and memory, and the decolonial kind of new stage of production of new narratives. I propose that Ukraine has fully entered into a process of decolonial release after 2022, and this process is marred by increased production of new narratives fostered by the war, which is particularly reflected in art. In my research on Ukrainian art, I use predominantly decolonial theory, but I emphasize the necessity of developing a new methodology that would account of the particular situation of, for example, shared border and geographic proximity between Ukraine and Russia, which formed a particular postcolonial relationship between the two countries. Speaking about Ukrainian art, I find it useful to apply the concept of horizontal art history proposed by art historian Petr Petrovsky. As a non-linear, diffuse, and polyphonic model, which calls to consider every local art scene individually in its own social and political context, and challenges hierarchical vertical art history, which divides the field into centers and peripheries of art production. For example, Ukrainian art history is crafted from notions and visualities belonging to different ideologies, once suppressed cultural elements and distorted identities, each proper for its location. Although Petrovsky himself didn't use his theory as decolonial or postcolonial, addressing his approach, I will explore how the recent decolonial turn, following the beginning of the full-scale invasion, redefined contemporary art history in the region and reimagined the space of art production. So, to start with the examples, kind of to show more kind of the connection between how this theory can be applied and how this theory can be demonstrated through particular case studies of Ukrainian wartime art. I will start with the Ukrainian artist Alevtina Kakhidze, who reflects on important political and social topics related to the war of Russia against Ukraine. Born in the Donetsk region, Kakhidze experienced all the implications of the ruining effect of the war on the territories occupied by Russia in 2014. And reflected this in her art. Kakhidze's project Invasions was recently shown at Manifesta Biennial in Kosovo, and it includes a collaboration with documentary filmmaker Piotr Armenovsky, which is a 360-degree film, Invasions 1, 2, 3, where the action begins next to the graveyard monument of Kakhidze's mother, Lyudmila Andreevna. And this monument is constructed in a shape that represents the artist's childhood house. Her mother, a retired teacher, nicknamed by her by her students Klubnika or Strawberry Andreevna, lived in the town of Zhdanivka, located in the Donetsk region, occupied by pro-Russian militants of the so-called Donetsk People Republic in 2014. From the very beginning of the war with Russia and until untimely death at the military outpost when crossing the border between occupied territories and Ukrainian land in 2019, Kakhidze's mother couldn't see her daughter in person because she was isolated practically in that territory. The artist took notes on their communication over the phone and later incorporated them into a series of drawings and handwritten notes under the general title Through the War with Strawberry Andreevna. Representing her mother's anxious but at the same time sincere interpretation of the military violence surrounding her home. The film by Kakhidze and Armenovsky develops the topic by looking at the aftermath of the full-scale invasion in Ukraine and particularly the Kiev region, resulting in death and destructions. The film permits changing angles of view because it's a 360-degree film, so it is possible to change perspectives inside of it. And allows a variety of perspectives which focus either on the ruins of the shelled buildings visited by the artist, the figures of witnesses of violence whom she interviews, or on peaceful parts of the surroundings which envelop the disastrous landscape. The point of view in this film is important for taking a certain personal position in regard to the atrocity and the effects of the invasion. It would seem that the postcolonial paradigm unfolded in this film in full, as it proposes the ambivalent vision of the surrounding reality and the ruining effects of the war. The possibility of either immersion into the situation or avoiding traumatic narratives by looking away from it is central to the postcolonial ambivalence that, as interpreted by critical theorist Homi Bhabha, occurs when the oppressor and the oppressed regard one another within an ambiguous perspective in the context of hybridity, when the dominant culture infects its colonial domain with its own identity and its own perspective. Therefore, any event in this situation of ambivalence can be interpreted as double-sided. This choice of perspective in the context of military aggression is, however, illusory, because we cannot avoid it, to see in this aggression, as any attempt to look away from atrocity would only remark its presence in the scene, even if it is an invisible presence. By making the viewer face the situation, the film of Kahidze and Darmenovsky simultaneously demonstrates the impossibility of such an action, of avoiding when postcolonial hybridity and ambivalence are dismantled. It is unavoidable to see the destruction brought about by Russia's neocolonial attempts, and witnesses of violence return to a single perspective which constitutes real-time anti-colonial resistance. This work by Kahidze and Darmenovsky enters into dialogue with earlier works of the hybrid stage of the war of Russia against Ukraine that preceded the full-scale invasion. Those that directly addressed postcolonial ambivalence as overshadowing the condition of violence and the resultant invisibility of the Russian war on the territory of Ukraine. One such project, which reflects on partial visions of war violence, is the series Blind Spot by Mykola Rydny. In this series of photographs of a building of several buildings in eastern Ukraine heavily damaged by Russian shelling, a circular blind spot, which is in fact a black ink blot, obscures significant part of every image. In some works, the extent of the destruction is covered in ink and thus no longer visible, permitting only the surrounding landscape to be seen, while in others the rubble is visible through though it is seemingly removed from its surrounding context. In a version of the project realized together with the Ukrainian poet Sergei Zhadan on a large banner partially covering a building in Berlin, a small circular view of rubble from a destroyed building in Lugansk appears to float in a field of black. Rydny visually addresses the gradual loss of visibility of violence and involuntary societal blindness to traumatic war events. Zhadan, in his turn, uses words to address the theme of destruction, recalling the bombing of a museum in Donetsk in his text, called The Executed Museum, and it was called in Ukrainian, but it was translated as The Ruined Museum. And he pointed out that the devastation of buildings and cultural heritage rarely stays in the public memory of those who didn't inhabit the place in which this destruction occurred, only remaining in the memory of those who survived the aggression. This work can also be read in a more general way, as a metaphor of the invisibility of evil as a postcolonial condition, or more specifically, for the fact that peripheral territories in eastern Ukraine were not considered of ultimate importance when the war broke out there in 2014. In 2022, however, it has become clear that the abundance of the topic of the war in the East didn't resolve the problem, but rather made it deeper. And the crimes, now the crimes hiding behind blind spots are in plain sight. The contextualization of war effects in the works by Rydny represents what decolonial scholar Boaventura de Sousa Santos calls absent subjects, where the subjects of knowledge production are deemed incapable of being such due to their nature, which is interpreted either as a lack of experience, lack of authority, or simply being unintelligible for dominant knowledge structures. This can be related to their weaker peripheral position in what decolonial theory calls the colonial matrix of power, which is a rigid hierarchical structure which reproduces coloniality even after the era of global colonialism has an end. With the spread of the war effects on the entire territory of Ukraine, this approach of discursive omission of the occupied territories, which was criticized by Ridney and Jadon, is radically changing today. This includes a transition from a postcolonial, slow, step-by-step cultural transformation between 2014 and 2022 to a rapid decolonial cultural shift, which we can witness starting from 2022. It is noteworthy, however, that the same understanding of absent subject, as in the case of Donbass, was until recently applied to entire Ukraine, as a less experienced new state formed presumably after 1991 and deprived of its knowledge before this date, because this knowledge was largely disputed and appropriated by Russia. Okay, to continue the topic of invisibility, Dana Kavelina's 2019 series, which is called Communications, Exit to the Blind Spot, takes on another aspect of invisibility imposed by neo-colonial oppression. In her drawing, a woman kills the son of the enemy, a woman recreates the logic of war. The artist takes the viewer to the effect of rape as a consequence of war. An attempt of killing a child conceived by an enemy kills the own child of this woman, connected to her by an umbilical cord, which becomes a murder tool. The artist reflects on how violence, not only physical, but also epistemic, and the extreme transgression of intimate space procreate. In this work, Kavelina points out that the immersion into war and the hate produced by it often becomes a self-destructive mechanism. And at the same time, she points out the particular vulnerability of civilian women in the conditions of war. This project was made in 2019 in the context of the reported atrocities in the east of Ukraine after the occupation of 2014, which were almost fully omitted by media and society's attention. The distance from the war and the Ukrainian society's indifference to the presence of it in the east of the country at that time, and the silence of victims of violence, were also addressed in Kavelina's drawing From the Threads of Silence, a Pullover for a Soldier is Hewn, from the same series. The red sweater for the Russian soldier, as a symbol of violence and atrocity he brings with him, is crafted from the silence of those who are afraid to speak about this crime, which negates the right to corporeality to its victims. The decolonial turn that dismantled the postcolonial ambivalence in Ukraine, with a widespread effect on the entire post-Soviet space, showed that there are no blind spots, as both ruination and peaceful life are visible, as in the aforementioned film by Kahidze and Arminovsky. And at the same time, the dramatic discrepancy between the past and the present is being erased. The full-scale invasion, however, brought about a different type of unintelligibility, the incomprehensive nature of the atrocities that unfold on the territory of Ukraine following 2022. And the Ukrainian society and the world failed to realize the full extent of violence against Ukrainian civilians and military alike that affected the zones invaded by the Russian army for following February of the past year. The drawing Bucha, Me 47 Minutes by Car by Alevtina Kahidze depicts the impossibility of visually recording the extreme violence that occurred in Bucha, in a town near Kiev that was heavily affected by the Russian occupation, with more than 300 civilians killed by the Russian army and buried in mass graves in spring of 2022. The artist's body is bent in sorrow, shown in front of a vast red spot, which marks the massacre of civilians and numerous rapes that Russian soldiers performed there. This work directly addresses the unrepresentability of violence, an important notion that entered the European scholarly and philosophical discourses in the aftermath of the Second World War and the crimes of the Holocaust. Kahidze's work echoes and directly refers to, as we see in her drawing to the right, to German philosopher Theodor Adorno's famous statement that to write a poem after Auschwitz is barbaric, as very artistic representation of death becomes as excessive as unnecessary after the horror of the unspeakable. Similarly, the Ukrainian immediate experience of the war brought about the idea that any attempts to represent this violence are inevitably reductive and that the only way to truly confront its horror is to acknowledge its unrepresentability. From a decolonial point of view, this unrepresentability presents a problem of forming an epistemological basis and as the creation of new knowledge, because it is obstructed by the impossibility of visualization of the events, and consequently the impossibility of comprehension of their magnitude. Therefore, the violence and suffering can be often silenced and ignored by still dominant postcolonial narratives. The task of Kahidze in this work is to return their representability through directly addressing them and by representing her own experience of life in the proximity to the massacre. But not showing the traumatic event itself, but her reaction to it, condensed to a seemingly naive reflection. Such a decolonial gesture challenges what Jacques Rancière calls a modernist vision of unrepresentability, which, according to the philosopher, deprives victims of their image, turning instead to the depiction of the atrocity as a rhetorical figure. Kahidze emphasizes the communication between the artist and the event. And in this way, she shows this event through a relative connection between the two. As the decolonial turn in the conditions of external aggression brings new visibilities and at the same time overshadows selected element in social and cultural spheres, the situation requires a new approach to memory. The necessity of the production of new narratives in a time of war implies an extended process of documentation as the initial process of the creation of a new production of knowledge free of colonial influences. In contrast to the 2014-2022 stage of the war, between 2014 and 2022, when Ukrainian art largely turned to their interpretations of contested history as part of the postcolonial recombination process, the post-2022 situation is characterized by the active focus on the production of works that narrate immediate experiences of the artists as witnesses of the aggression, and aim to record a completely new stage in Ukrainian history without extended references to the past. The increased production of narratives as a collective movement helps challenge the center-periphery model, marking the final dismantling of post-Soviet space. Also, this decolonial disentanglement manifests Ukrainian exit from the blind spot in international visibility. The emerging decoloniality in Ukrainian art after 2022 permits a variety of perspectives, but postcolonial ambivalence and hybridity are erased as a continuous process as a result of Russia's unequivocal extreme aggression in Ukraine's territory. Жанна Kadyrova's series, Data Extraction, presents the idea of a place preserving the knowledge as the evidence of the atrocity and taking part in the formation of new historical memory, but in most direct way. In her ready-made installation, Data Extraction Irpin, 2022, the artist focuses on the destiny of the city of Irpin in the Kiev region, where the Russian invasion in the spring 2022 caused significant damages and numerous deaths among civilians. The work displays a cross-section of asphalt damaged by a missile from the city of Irpin's district, Irpinsky Lipki. And this demonstrates the extent of destruction that the city suffered during the Russian invasion of the town. Initiated in 2011, the series Data Extraction consists of extracted pieces of concrete and asphalt, and it has changed its conceptual focus and objectives over time. First, the project in 2011 aimed to map the streets of Kiev to record the renovation of the roads in the city for the Euro 2012 football championship. They served at the time as criticism of the exclusively superficial changes as a sign of corruption in the city reconstruction. After 2014, the artist turned to the documentation of damage in various cities of Ukraine due to Russian military actions, including materials from the occupied territories. And finally, after 2022, as we see in this example, the work expanded due to the increased level of destruction which the artist aimed to document. The series represents a different kind of war documentation, where the physical proof of destruction is preserved as a ready-made. The use of stone and asphalt as durable materials refer to the long-term effects of such destruction and its inscription into public memory. This project, in its new version, is also one of the early attempts at memorialization, where the real-life evidence of aggression is transported to a gallery space and displayed to the public. Moving from the critique of reconstruction to the documentation of war-caused damages, this project changed its orientation from internal, focusing on local social and political tensions, to external, focusing on traumatic effects of the ongoing war. Kadyrova's forensic work with direct evidence is an example of how the memory of the ongoing atrocity is formed. The unprocessed documentation as a ready-made comes in consequence of no time distance, which would help comprehend the traumatic experience of the ruination and death. The new decolonial epistemology manifests here as a documentation without any mediation, as direct evidence of the crimes and its immediate inscription into public memory. The forensic approach through reconstruction of the events by the otherwise peripheral evidence, which connotes the situation of the war, but doesn't fully speak of it, is the focus of the work Repeat After Me by Open Group. And these are the photographs from the exhibition I Dreamt of Beasts, curated by Katarina Yakovlenko and Galina Gleba in Labyrinth Gallery in Poland. This is a video, this project is a video which features interviews with displaced people from Ukraine's eastern and southern regions who found their shelter in Lviv. The interviewees do not narrate their experience in the video. Instead, they imitate a variety of sounds brought by the war. The noise produced by different types of military equipment, shelling by rockets, weapons, anti-aerial defense, and drones. Ironic at first glance, as it is repeated by eyewitnesses, this practical knowledge of how different types of military equipment sound refers to the conditions of survival in the war circumstances. After more than a year of a full-scale invasion, Ukrainian society obtained expertise in distinguishing between different sounds that indicate a different degree of danger. This intrinsic knowledge helps to reconstruct the event ongoing around without seeing the cause of this event, and thus undertaking a decision how to protect oneself from possible dangers brought about by this sound. The video has an interactive component which invites the audience to repeat those sounds, in this way sharing the knowledge which is unlikely to obtain in peaceful circumstances, but is crucial as life-saving in the conditions of the war. The epistemological basis that is formed in this work shows how the shift in the forms of perception and expression occurs, and the new knowledge is validated through life-threatening conditions. The decolonial process here is ongoing through the production of a new narrative which is actualized only by the context of the situation and which looks redundant outside of it, such as, for example, repeating of the section inside the gallery by the audience. The dialogue which this work establishes with the audience outside the war zone proposes to recontextualize this knowledge, to extend its foundations beyond the territory of the immediate war impact. Oля Mikhailuk's new film, Irpin, Chronicles of Revival, from 2022, features a similar epistemological inquiry through facing direct witnesses and survivors of violent events in the town of Irpin. However, in this project, Mikhailuk turns to the direct speech of the eyewitnesses. The artist looks at the revival of the city following the destructions and numerous deaths through the lens of the connection between the people and the nature that surrounds them, making parallels between reconstruction and natural regeneration. The inhabitants of Irpin speak about their gardens, show the plants they take care of, and share their losses of relatives and friends that occurred because of the Russian aggressions. For example, in the episode Pani Tanya, which is the image to the left of the screen, the interviewee begins her narration by sharing her memories of the forest that surrounded the town in the past, and further talks about the garden that she has and from which she supports her living. At some moment in her monologue, she tells about her grandson Dima, who died from shelling and was buried in her garden for several weeks during the Russian occupation of the area. The story continues with Pani Tanya proudly giving a detailed tour of vegetables and flowers growing in the same garden. The trauma of the loss interweaves with the hope of revival that her garden gave to her. Both nature and culture participate in this historical process of Ukrainian society resistance to the invasion and overcoming its aftermath. As we speak about this end of postcolonial situation and beginning of reconstruction and recovery after the war. Now, the work of Dana Kavelina, a film, Letter to a Turtle Dove, made in 2020, presented a bridge between the distant documentary way of seeing of war events for the post-2014 hybrid situation and the personalized reflection on violence that became more apparent after February 2022. In this film, the artist appropriated and reinterpreted the found 5-hour footage of post-2014 events inside the Donbass region by an anonymous author, titled To Watch the War. It was the name of the footage. The artist incorporated violent and transgressive scenes taken in the occupied east of Ukraine between 2014 and 2018 into her film and responded to them in a manner of the artist's poetic monologue, with inclusions of animated scenes, stage interventions, and archival footage from Soviet Donbass. In multiple layers, ranging from literary to amateur documentary forms, the film explores the historical relationship between Russian colonialism in Ukraine and military aggression in the regions occupied after 2014, as an attempt to look at the outbreak of violence following 2014, where Donbass appears, in the artist's own words, not as a passive victim of the aggression, but the victim that has agency in encapsulating Russia's violence on its territory. A capacity for such enveloping is defined by the region's entangled and complex past, constituted by conflicting identities and uneven layers of political and social history. The non-linear structure of the film shows this continuity as seen through the eyes of a victim of violence as both an eyewitness of atrocities and a martyr, because it is precisely this position that she remarks on, the position of a martyr which reclaims agency through self-sacrifice. And some last examples. The work by Katerina Lisovenko discusses the utopian dimension of this future decolonial release. Her work is called Propaganda of the World of My Dreams, the Last Day of the Last Totalitarianism. And it was created in 2022. This large-scale painting depicts a mythical space where the agency is restored and the borders that enclose Ukrainian society are broken, giving them the path to liberation and emancipation. While some creatures from Lisovenko's bestiary mourn their dead, others move to the endless blank space beyond the limits of their enclosure. As the final defense of colonialism and the decolonial release also means the reunification of spaces of freedom, the erasure of differences, and the elimination of the characteristics of otherness through both territorial and personal integrity. The mythical world of Lisovenko reflects on pain and grief, but also the hope of erasure of barriers and reclaiming of agency that is forthcoming. This work represents the final aim of decoloniality, which, as defined by decolonial scholars such as Madina Tlastanova, is an unachievable horizon of consolidated efforts in resistance to the effects of colonization, which in the case of Ukraine obtained a new dimension of resilience in the face of imminent colonizing attempts from the side of Russia, which is also rather anachronic for the age when the global empires have fallen. And the final example is again Dana Kavelina with her unfinished film Mother Srebrenica, Mother Donbass, which she started in 2021, but she still didn't have a possibility to finish. And this film focuses on resistance to cruel acts of the war through reclaiming the agency again. And the artist addresses the ultimate goal of resistance both to contemporary violence and the epistemic violence expressed throughout the formation of the history of atrocities and genocide. In this film, the violence of mass atrocity is reinterpreted through the comparative perspective on the Holocaust, particularly the Lviv pogrom of 1941, the Srebrenica massacre, and the war in the Donbass. The artist reimagines the story of the war to the one where the victims of the Holocaust are not exhumed after their violent deaths, but are resurrected by means of placing a slip of parchment in their mouth. This reference to the 16th century legend of Golem, who was resurrected after receiving a slip with a name, calls to the epistemic change in the recognition of the victims of war-caused violence, their identification and finding their role in history. After witnessing the aftermath of the Russian invasion in the Kiev region and beyond, with mass graves of Ukrainian civilians discovered in the released territories, and numerous more yet to discover, this project takes on a new magnitude of war crimes, all of which must be properly recorded, described, and eventually prosecuted. The hope for resurrection, expressed by the artist in the synthesis of history and mythical dimension, is her anticipation of Ukraine's post-war reconstruction and decolonial regeneration, as well as the call for the effective preservation of the memory of those who suffered from the aggression. The identification of all the victims of the Russian aggression and restoration of their agency is a key task which will bring the decolonial processes further. The knowledge about the real state of human losses and the truth about war crimes will help in the formation of the epistemological basis for the disentangled history of the war. This process is seen as opposed, for example, to the suppressed traumatic history of the Soviet time, from the Soviet governments concealing the crimes of the Great Famine of 1932-33 in Ukraine to the suppression of memory of those killed in the Holocaust and repressed also during the Stalinist terror. Breaking up with a postcolonial perspective is the first step in this way, and Ukrainian artists contribute to this process with their focus on both first-hand documentation of the war and its critical reflection. As the artist Mykola Ridney points out, a critical temporal distance is needed to fully evaluate the effects of the war on Ukrainian society and culture. However, Ukrainian artists' immediate work on the creation of new disentangled epistemologies and narratives of resistance, as well as the focus on the reinstitution of previously absent subjects, is the key to the decolonization of the Ukrainian cultural sphere. This radical change, when the postcolonial situation in Ukraine has been replaced by the process of decolonial release, must be reflected in tectonic shifts in research on Ukraine. And the important aspect here is the necessity of the development of new ways and languages of description and analysis as part of the decolonial knowledge production process, which is rooted in the creation of new narratives. And it's important to say that postcolonial theory and decolonial theory that I referred to throughout this presentation have their disciplinary limitations in the analysis of the particular Ukrainian case, as they were formed in different contexts of coloniality, for example, that of Latin America, if we think about decolonial theory, or other countries of the global south, and do not fully reflect on the characteristics of Ukrainian former entanglement. From which, kind of to mention but few, is the shared border with the former colonial state, the anachronic recreation of the imperial ambition by Russia, in time when the empires of the world have fallen, and also Russia's current borrowing of the Soviet Union's Cold Wartime propaganda narratives of anti-imperialist struggle, which is also a reflection of Ukraine's recent position of what Vitaly Chernetsky, for example, called postcolonial in the Second World. So all this set of characteristics doesn't allow to address the situation in Ukraine, both social and cultural situations, through existing methodologies. It is essential to develop a theory beyond the postcolonial and decolonial dichotomy, together with a methodology and terminology, which could correctly position and discuss Ukraine's situation. So, thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Svitlana. And a reminder for our virtual audience: if you have a question, please submit it via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter @Kennan Institute, or on our Facebook page at any time. Please include your name and affiliation. So My initial question is, when did this decolonial experience start? So did it start at independence in 1991, or is it only after the war that Ukraine has brought in another narrative that goes against the colonial narrative?
Thank you for your question. My position is that this decolonial situation started developing with the events of 2013-2014 with the Euromaidan protests, and then with following Russian invasion and occupation of part of Ukraine. And that's when this process kind of started, but my position is that it unfolded in full already in 2022, when kind of there was this merging of this two worlds, and there was this facing of the direct aggression by most of the territory of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. And how do people gain access to this very interesting art that has emerged after this invasion? Are there exhibits? Obviously, some of it is on video. So how widespread is this post-colonial discussion amongst Ukrainians and artists?
I think it is currently it is essential, actually, because all this discussion on work with post-colonial narratives and the decolonization of different public discourses is currently kind of very present, and particularly among artists and scholars. As for the exhibitions, most of the exhibitions of Ukrainian art, which are numerous lately, they take place outside Ukraine, of course, because there is, of course, a difficulty to present something on the territory of Ukraine. But there is, I would say, kind of quite a good exchange between different, let's say, research traditions and the different visual traditions, because Ukrainian artists used also the situation of displacement as a possibility to establish a wider dialogue and contextualize their art in a wider form. Yes, this discussion is ongoing. It proceeds from Ukraine, but of course there is a certain delegation of this dialogue to expanding to the territories beyond Ukraine.
And one last, we'll start with a question here. Yes.
Svitlana, thank you so much for your interesting presentation. I'm Katya Ruban. I'm a Ukrainian historian, and currently I'm a fellow at GW. I just want to continue something that you already started to talk about the audience for this artists and for these artworks. You already mentioned that the primary audience for them is now the Western audience. And even here in DC, I've been here only for 5 months, but there have been already 2 exhibitions of Ukrainian artists. And like everyone whom you mentioned here, I had a chance to see here in DC. But my understanding that to read and to understand that these works are about decoloniality, one needs to have a really good knowledge and understanding of the Ukrainian and Russian history. One really needs to know the context of this work, the political context of this work. When I go to these exhibitions, first of all, here I'm talking about the exhibition Women at War, which was here in DC, and now there is an exhibition at Arlington Contemporary Art Museum where you can see works, for example, by Ridney. There you cannot find this context. Basically, on the wall there is just like, title, the name of the artist, the title, the year, and like 3-4 sentences. Basically, and I've been talking with some people with whom I visited this exhibition, I mean like local people who live in DC, and my feeling that this decolonial message is not clear. And sometimes it's like totally lost when it's like, when the people do not have really this good knowledge of the context and of Ukrainian and Russian history. What do you think about it, about this situation and how we can actually change it? Thank you.
So thank you for your question. I think that there are two different levels here. One is the level of artistic interpretation, and another level is the level of kind of theoretical development that goes already after the artistic interpretation. And while we can see to some extent the first of those, the artistic interpretation by itself present in the exhibition. Of course, no exhibition can cover all these complex theoretical connections that can be made. And this is already the task of art history in addressing these topics, in connecting these individual works. So I think this work needs to be done on kind of on different levels, on curatorial level and then also on a theoretical level, in order kind of to make this kind of more global contribution. And through combination of both, we can precisely establish this dialogue. Maybe not to full extent with general audiences, but with specialists in art, in cultural history, and kind of wider range of disciplines, kind of more academic way. But also, I think this is a process that is necessary because it will help place Ukrainian art and Ukrainian art history into this global framework. It's something that is completely lacking now. There is an enormous lack of conceptualization and interpretation, even description of Ukrainian art practices and the ways how they connect to these global narratives. And to connect to global narratives, we first need to explore these internal connections that are also kind of, they also need description. And I think only addressing this process as this some kind of all-involving process, a process that is ongoing on different levels, it is possible actually to present fully Ukrainian art and Ukrainian culture and its situation. And this is something that will contribute to the study of Ukraine and Ukrainian art inside Ukraine and outside Ukraine, because anyway, it is interconnected processes.
Again, for our virtual audience, if you'd like to ask a question, please submit it via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter @Kennan Institute, or on our Facebook page. Do I see a hand up? Zach.
I'm curious about how the art of the 90s, the movements that emerged after the fall of the Soviet Union, that could be described as like post-Soviet art, differ from the movements that you described aesthetically and in terms of decoloniality. And then also, from my understanding, like a lot of these art movements were supported by Western NGOs. And is that something that Ukrainian artists still want, or are they more so looking to have homegrown art organizations? So, yeah.
Thank you for the question. If we think about the art of 90s, kind of in this post-Soviet, immediate post-Soviet experience, I think there was more work there precisely with these questions of memory and history and how all these historical issues are reconsidered and how they're applied to Ukrainian realities of that time. And of course, it was kind of a moment of big big change. And re-identification, a moment of, but it was a kind of re-identification of different type, because yes, at that moment there were institutions like Soros Center, for example, that emerged in the territory of Ukraine, and a number of both Western and local institutions working on that. But now I think the situation is kind of different because it is more decentralized. It has been a result of precisely efforts of decentralization in Ukrainian culture that were undertaken after 2014, where many of these institutions, Ukrainian institutions, they emerged locally to support art practices. For example, in my other presentation, I speak about in my other presentations that I will have in George Washington University on Thursday, I will speak precisely about this institutional dimension and how institutions contributed to decentralization. So it's a combination of individual efforts, like private efforts, a diversity of NGOs from different parts of Ukraine that support this, and of course there is some kind of more like global dialogue ongoing. But in this case, it's difficult to distinguish kind of which is the main force, the main moving force behind this. I would say that is rather some kind of rather individual motivation of every artist to talk about this topic, because this is a topic that is extremely important at this moment, and as difference with the situation of this immediate post-Soviet experience, we see that actually the narratives, as I mentioned, they're turning to the present and not to the past. They are not aiming to revise the past. They are aiming to reflect on the present and to record the present and to create some kind of an archive of the present. Yes, and this contributes precisely to this decolonial perspective.
So you mentioned some of the artists that are engaged in this work. I was struck by the one who was in Donetsk. So to what extent is this decolonial movement led by Lviv or Kiev? And to what extent is it kind of in the longer occupied territories?
There is a huge contribution of artists from the occupied territories, because in 2014 there were many artists that they needed to become refugees from the occupied regions, and they contributed greatly to the documentation of all the situation of the war in Donbass and in Crimea also, and precisely they worked as some kind of conduits of the situation for the rest of Ukrainian society, and this is precisely was important to create this epistemology of all the situation, and in this case also we can think about when the displacement went further with the invasion of 2022. Also there is a great role of organizations in the west of the country that they became kind of shelters for individual artists, and they fostered artistic exchange, because there are several initiatives of artistic residences that they find themselves in the regions of Lviv, Ivano-Frankivsk, and all this area, because it's a safe area. And this helped actually to support what I call in internal hybridity as opposed to this postcolonial hybridity, which is dismantling. Internal hybridity is kind of larger exchange of all these topics and narratives and points of view and perspectives, and mutual support of artists from different regions, which helps to some kind of, from one side, unification kind of these practices, but from the other side to produce some kind of deeper nuances among them. Because if we see an exhibition, for example, of artists, displaced artists from Kherson in Uzhgorod, of course, it's kind of different context for this exhibition, but also it brings something to local audiences and some kind of new perspectives and new understandings. So I would say that this process, in terms of Ukrainian territory, is kind of a quite dynamic process of interaction and exchange. And this is some kind of unexpected positive side effect of all this horrible war situation.
So, how have the occupiers reacted to this new art? Has the Russians been able to repress artists in the occupied territories? I would think that they would do everything possible to make sure that this art isn't examined by the public. So to what extent has this been repressed, as it were, by the Russians who in the various occupied regions?
Well, now the situation is that most of the artists who were in the occupied regions, they are displaced currently, but artists, they kind of usually they become targets of aggression, because the artists kind of, especially politically and socially engaged art practices, they're more kind of practices of a protest. There has been a case of one artist who recently disappeared from Kherson region. Precisely, he was the founder of so-called Kherson Museum of Contemporary Art, which was a private initiative. And until now, he disappeared in October, and until now his whereabouts are not known. So. There have been kind of several cases of this type, but mostly, of course, even though artists needed to kind of to leave behind their past, their the places where they lived in, and to some extent their families, like the case of Levtina Kahidze, for example. Also, of course, kind of all this danger of the situation of being an artist and in an occupied territory is kind of understood by everyone. So when there was a possibility of displacement in between 2014 and 2022, of course, there was it was used, but. The situation after 2022, it changed already much of this, because basically we cannot speak about just kind of isolated territories that were occupied. There was a large amount of territories, especially all this horrible situation in the vicinity of Kiev that no one expected. And this affected artists as regular citizens of Ukraine. It affected everybody.
Any last questions? Lauren.
To what extent since you said that most of the art or these exhibits are happening outside of Ukraine right now, to what extent are these narratives of decolonization, how are they received within Ukraine? To what extent do they resonate with a broader Ukrainian public?
There is, thank you for a question. There is the discussion on the discussion is vividly ongoing. There is a variety of perspectives, of course, of how actually the decolonization should be seen by different groups of people in Ukrainian culture, and there is also an attempt to regulate somehow through legislative dimension of it, and there have been a law accepted by the parliament with the corrections that were most recently done in March. It was a law on decolonization which focused on the changes in toponymy and renaming different streets and locations, and also the policy regarding Soviet time monuments and those monuments that are considered as kind of signs of symbols of imperial past and as kind of wide definition. But of course, when it comes as some kind of, in my personal opinion, when it comes as this centralized attempt of changing things in this way, changes can be only superficial, because there should be kind of a more profound work that is not as much rooted in these dichotomies and binary oppositions, but in more kind of a constructive way. For example, when I speak about this creation of new knowledges, I merely describe the process that is already ongoing. It will be ongoing with my description of it or without. But this is something that occurs as kind of natural response, as part of this resilience, as part of resistance process to the war, and part of something that will become the process of reconstruction of Ukraine after the war finishes. And this, I think, is kind of inevitably there will be differences in ways of seeing how decolonization should continue. But this process is already ongoing, and as all this disentanglement happened because of all this impossibility to kind of to continue using the same knowledge as we had before the war, and especially the escalation of the war. So these discussions, they will also continue.
Well, thank you very much, Svitlana, for a really interesting presentation. For our virtual audience, please visit our website if you want to stay up to date with our upcoming events and publications. And you can find our latest analysis of events in Ukraine, Russia, and the region in our Russia file, Focus Ukraine, and in Other Words blog. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you.